Dr. Roger Bretherton. Roger comes to us from the University of Lincoln. He's a clinical psychologist and he works in general practice and has done in the past for the NHS, and researches and teaches in the University of Lincoln. And he's got a particular interest in the area of character and well-being, and he'll perhaps explain to us how that spins out into a large number of different areas. Now, this last session is going to be a little bit different. It's not a straight talk as such, so we will have a question time at the end, but it is a little bit longer, so we shall go on now to the end of our session. But I'm going to hand over to Roger, and he'll guide us through this session. So thank you for being with us, and welcome.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for staying for this final session. I didn't know how many people I'd be addressing by the end of the day, so thank you for that. I was at a conference last weekend in Oxford, and I have to say, I sneaked off for the final session, so if I were you, I might not be here if this wasn't my session. As I was introduced, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I wrote my doctorate 20 years ago on post-traumatic stress disorder. I particularly was looking at victims of road traffic accidents, or road traffic collisions as we call them now, because most of them aren't accidents. There's usually someone at fault. And I was looking at, I was trying to check out a sort of myth that had been spread while I was in training, which was really the idea that if someone was in trauma, you shouldn't treat them until their legal case had settled. So if they're traumatized and they're claiming compensation in law, that would interfere with their treatment. And effectively what I did was follow up a few hundred people who'd been through legal cases and also had therapy, and looked at, did people still get better at times in response to therapy, even if they were still trying to settle a case. And one of the things that my study showed quite conclusively is, actually, generally speaking, whether or not people had settled their legal case, they tended to get better with any kind of therapy. Therapy did something for them. Good treatment did. But actually the money, the compensation, made no difference whatsoever to their well-being, apart from in the case where people received significant physical disabilities, and then of course it actually helped improve their life to quite a high extent. And so I started my life sort of studying trauma, and while I was doing that, at the same time as I'm writing my doctorate, I was also at the same time, and lots of people laugh when they hear me say this, I was writing commentary on the epistle to James, so epistle by James, in the New Testament. And so I was doing this sort of in my spare time, enjoying myself, meditating on it, reading different sources, trying to get to grips with it. And I was really taken with the third verse of James, right at the beginning, where it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you encounter trials, tribulations, testing of many kinds." Because effectively it was saying, when you encounter these things and you respond to them in the right way, it develops character, and character in time develops perseverance, and perseverance eventually delivers you mature and complete. And so I'm in the middle of studying trauma, and at the same time I'm kind of reading this Bible verse, and it's one of kind of three verses very similar to that, one with Peter, one in Romans, that kind of seem to imply that suffering in life can bring about good things for us. And it seems to be completely contradictory to a lot of what I was studying at that point of time. So I shared this with a friend of mine, and he said, well, why don't we write something on this for a psychology journal? So he went away. He had more time than I did at that moment. He went away and did a huge literature review and effectively uncovered a massive field of literature that is sometimes now called post-traumatic growth, or sometimes adversarial growth, which, he pulled out hundreds of papers effectively really showing decisively that there are quite a number of people who go through traumatic or adversarial situations, and they come out saying things like, I'm more courageous, I'm better at vulnerability, I have deeper compassion, I'm wiser, I have closer relationships with other people. And so they're describing all these sort of characterological changes as a result of their trauma. And so he and I published this. We published it with the British Psychological Society. And overnight, just by accident, we then became the European experts in post-traumatic growth. And so we start traveling around Europe talking about this kind of thing. And in a sense, that was my induction as a clinical psychologist to start thinking about the notion of character. I'll do my best to define character in a moment. But then in my professional life, I went on to work with people who were chronically suicidal or self-harming. Very often in the NHS, they'd receive diagnoses of personality disorder. And the approach I was using was called dialectical behavior therapy. And one of the ideas behind that approach is that rather than saying what's wrong with this person, you say what's missing. What's the skill that this person really needs to learn that would then replace some of the dysfunctional habits they've developed? So do they need some compassion? Do they need to learn some acceptance? Do they need some self-regulation? Do they need to make some wise decisions? Do they need some courage or some social intelligence to be able to ask for what they want? Are there areas where actually it would be appropriate for them to step into some kind of forgiveness in a relationship? And so again, this all becomes the language of character. It's kind of beginning to say, what are the good things in life that we need to learn that seem to do us good? And that's where the area of character I'm going to talk about comes from today. So some of you will have encountered the book The Road to Character by David Brooks. I don't know if any of you have seen that book. He's a journalist for the United States. He's not a philosopher, but I think he has some really good philosophical instincts in the way that he writes. And he's beginning to think about character. He says, the resume virtues, the ones you list on your resume, the skills that you bring to the job market that contribute to external success. The eulogy virtues are deeper. They're the virtues that get talked about at your funeral, the ones that exist at the core of your being, whether you're kind, brave, honest, faithful, what kind of relationships you formed. Most of us would say that the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume virtues, but most of us have clearer strategies for how to achieve career success than we do for how to develop a profound character. And it's the kind of quote that really strikes home for me really strongly, because in essence, I sort of spend my whole life answering three questions. One is, how do we define good elements of character? And as a psychologist, it's like, can we measure them? If we do measure them, how would we measure them? Secondly, what do good elements of character do for us? So if we were to take dependent variables off, hope, forgiveness, love, etc., what kind of well-being do they lead to? What kind of social things do they lead to, etc.? And then thirdly, what are the kind of interventions, the kind of exercises that seem to have a good evidence base that we can develop those things? You know, that it was certain things that if we do become more loving, we do become more forgiving, we do, etc., whatever the thing is. And so as a consequence, I've sort of found myself, having been a clinical psychologist, now as an academic, for the last 5 or 6 years or so, my job has really split 3 ways. So I do all the teaching that academics do, dissertation students, PhD students, all that kind of thing. I then do clear research on character. At the moment, I'm just about to come to the end of 2 grants. One was from the Templeton Religion Trust, looking at how congregations, the effect that congregation size has on the quality of the congregation. We're testing a biological theory that was put forward by an evolutionary biologist called Robin Dunbar, that basically saying that a human grouping of 150 is the sort of optimum or the maximum size at which we can be functional efficient. It's based on computations of the human brain in comparison to other primates, and basically calculates that to be the thing. And I've actually gone through the church planting literature way back to the 1960s, and effectively this figure of 150 comes up over and over and over and over and over again. What's that? Is there a minimum? There isn't a minimum, but things change as you get. So it's actually a series of iterations of size as you go on. So you can have a good congregation of 2, you can have a good one of 15, you can have a good one of 50, good one of 150, good one of 500, etc. It can go on. But each one of those sizes is actually almost like a different species of community. So I don't know if you've noticed that as church leaders, that actually they have to relate in really different ways. So that's one project. And then the other project that I'm in the final 6 months of, which draws on this material, this is the John Templeton Foundation, is called the Character Course. And basically what I was paid to do for 3 years was to adapt character psychology for a church-based small group audience. So we've been creating videos and resources and discussion and all this kind of thing. We've just validated it on about 1,000 people across the UK in what I call its brown paper bag form, which is just as quick and fast as we could possibly get it out there. And we've spent the last 3 months just polishing that up and making it work and look good. And that will be open access, available on a website in the next month or so. It depends how quickly we can get there. But Ruth has promised me that the moment it goes live, she will tweet it out to everybody who's connected to Faraday. So you can see that completely free. There's £160,000 worth of materials basically been put on this website. And once the project is over, anyone can have it and you can do what you like with it, videos, discussion exercises, etc. My pleasure. Another way to think about character, while we're at it, Stanley Hauerwas, probably one of the theologians who's spoken most and written most about character, is that he says character is who we are when no one's looking. Character so conceived suggests that a person of character is happy with who they are, so they don't have to try to be someone they're not. Whether alone or with others, they're the same person. Through the contingencies that constitute all lives, they have a life narrative that they believe makes them who they are. That's what it means to be a person of character. And the reason this is an important quote is because it starts to emphasize the notion of narrative in the building of character. And this is one of the places where Christian and theological approaches to character differ quite a bit from psychological approaches. So you'll notice once we get into the psychology that it's very, very pragmatic. So it's very helpful to see those different levels of analysis we talked about earlier on. So once we get into talking about the psychology, we're talking at a very, very pragmatic level about psychology. So just to keep that in mind, that's the way psychology tends to talk about character. But from a Christian point of view, we put character in a much bigger context. 2 years ago, the Journal for Positive Psychology, which is sort of the main journal in this field, gave aside a whole issue to Christians critiquing positive psychology and saying, what do we make of this and what would our critiques be? And one of them wrote quite a hilarious article in which he argued that positive psychology and psychology of character was the positive donut, he called it. So it's nice and sprinkly and fluffy around the outside, but it's lacking a central sense of coherence, something that unifies it. And he was arguing really that for us as Christians, that's Christ. For us as Christians, that's the sort of narrative into which God has called us. And one of the quotes that has summed this up for me is this quote from a theologian called Kessler. And he says, the mission of the church is to be a laboratory of the world's possibility. It's to be a utopian community. It's to be a test case for how humans might live together as diverse but unified. And he comes to that quote right at the end of a passage in which he's trying to make sense of why is it that Paul the Apostle is so obsessed with writing about character, that his epistles are absolutely filled with, it's all about grace and it's all about having faith in God and being saved by faith through grace, whichever way around you want to put that. But he says, but nevertheless, his letters are stacked with be kind, be humble, etc. These kind of commands. And I think if there's a way of putting the meta-narrative in which Christian character sits, I think my favourite way of doing it, as I've kind of studied many of the sort of different words in Scripture that sort of allude to character, whether it's righteousness or virtue or godliness or wholeness or perfection, maturity, so all these kind of things. My favourite word to sort of trace through Scripture to tell the story of character from a Christian point of view is the word fruit. Because it sort of starts in a garden where there's good fruit and bad fruit, and we eat the good fruit, but we also eat the bad fruit. And then it turns into a family, and the idea of this family is this is the family that will produce good fruit, but they then turn into a nation, and then this nation has various prophetic figures that come along and say you were supposed to produce this fruit, and you haven't produced it. Where is it? And then John the Baptist eventually comes along, and he says, basically, because as a nation you haven't produced this fruit, God is starting again. He's cutting down this big tree that he's tried to grow. It's going to go now, and we're going to start again. And then Jesus comes along and says, yes, but if you abide in me, you will bear good fruit. And then Paul says, and now thanks to the Holy Spirit living in us, we are beginning to produce this fruit in us as we live by the Holy Spirit and by Christ. And then it ends in a city that looks a little bit like the garden at the beginning, more people involved. There's this huge tree right at the heart of the city, and it's there, and it says, and it has fruit and leaves for the healing of the nations. And it's kind of like this idea of God's kind of story through history is really, I almost sometimes see God sort of hanging over the world and hanging over creation saying, where's the fruit? Where is this? And in a very sort of minor way, from a psychological and a theological kind of perspective, that's kind of the question I'm sort of sitting with really and trying to answer and think about. I'm using psychology as my way of asking the question. There's theological groundedness behind it that I just can't get into because I've literally got hundreds of pages, kind of theological reflection and word study, lexicography from the Bible in it. But then I'm applying it across all contexts. So some weeks I'm working with an international bank, then I'm speaking to undergraduate students, then I'm helping a mental health charity think about how they build character in people with mental health problems. I think my favorite week last year was in the same week. I think I went from an international bank to a research conference at Oxford University, back to teaching my undergraduates, and then went to a school and was teaching children in a classroom about gratitude at the end of the week. And it just really had this great idea of, plus supervising some PhD students in the middle, it had this lovely idea of this works everywhere. And so I suppose if I was going to put this all together, say really what I'm trying to do is develop a way of developing, as far as it's possible, Christ-like character in every context we can possibly get into. And the nice thing about psychology is that this isn't the truth. This bit that I'm talking about isn't the truth. So you know when you read C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, there's a lovely bit where he says, I've got a way of understanding this, but if it really doesn't work for you, don't ever think about it again, just ditch it. And in a sense, psychology is like that. It's kind of like it's got some great models. I think it's enormously helpful. There's some good scientific evidence behind it. But if you find that somehow this conflicts with your understanding of how character should be grown in Christianity, we can talk about that and we can work that out. But in the end, if by the end of this session you're thinking that isn't for me, fine. It really helps to teach psychology if you don't really believe it. So how did it begin? So, turn of the millennium, psychology took a sort of strange turn where probably the most famous clinical psychologist in the world, a guy called Martin Seligman, stood up and effectively said, up until now, psychology has been obsessed with the negative. At that point, I think for every one scientific article that had been published on love, gratitude, hope, etc., 26 had been published on stress, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia. And his argument was really, that's perfectly correct, and as a clinical psychologist, I agree that that's correct. It's important to study those things. But he said we do also need an understanding and a scientific approach to good things in life that's every bit as complex, detailed, scientific, enriched as our view as the negative is. Interestingly for me, that kind of came at a similar time where I was beginning to realize that as a Christian, I had, sometimes as a student, I had to preach the gospel in various kind of situations. And I very quickly began to realize that I had a really, really nuanced, complex understanding of sin. Could go on about it for hours, but not such a great understanding of grace and faith and hope and love and humility. That my understanding of those things was quite thin. And so this sort of turn in psychology really helped me to start to think about, let's actually attend to those elements of scripture and those elements of psychology a bit more closely. So what they did was, Seligman and his team, they started a multi-million-dollar project in which, to begin with, they did two things. Firstly, they gathered together dozens of pieces of literature from around the world in history that they were looking for literature where people described virtues. So all the major world religions were there, so they looked at Christianity and Buddhism and Judaism, Islam, Confucianism, Hinduism, kind of Athenian philosophy was in there. There's modern kind of approaches to humanism came into it. They also looked at sort of various films. They looked at the girl and boy scout movements. They even looked at Hallmark cards when people send cards to each other. How do they bless one another with good things? What kind of words come out? So they went right from deeply profound, thoughtful things right across to sort of quite odd, quirky things, really. But their aim was really to say, what are the key themes that seem to come out in all these places? What comes up when we look across all those things? And they came up with 6 major themes. So they called these the High Six. And as you can imagine, in psychology, it has been debated enormously how accurate these are, whether there should be 4 of them, whether there should be 2 or 3 or whatever. But the research is enough to say that these will do for now as an organisational principle. So they said, so when you look across the world through recorded history, these seem to be the kind of things that are celebrated. So knowledge, people who acquire and use knowledge, who are wise, who know what to do, who know how things work. Courage, exercising the will to accomplish goals in spite of opposition, people who push ahead, who stand their ground, who can persist. Humanity, so this is where notions of love, tending and befriending others, looking after them, care comes in. Justice, the ability to contribute to healthy community life, make it all work. Temperance, the protection against excess, not always the sexiest of the virtues, but nevertheless essential if violence, egotism, vices are to be restrained. And then transcendence, the ability to forge connections to larger universe and meaning. Now, the interesting thing, if you know your Aristotle well, you'll probably know that 4 of the cardinal virtues are there. So wisdom, courage, which he would have called fortitude, temperance and justice are there. If you know your Aquinas well, you'll know that Aquinas added to those 4 3 theological virtues, faith, hope and love, which interestingly in this model, love would appear in humanity, faith and hope would appear in transcendence. I have several friends who are sort of Thomistic philosophers who sort of follow Aquinas deeply, and they think Aquinas got it much better than these guys did, but there you go. And what they did there was they said, that's great, we've got that. They sent one guy called Robert Biswas Diner all over the world. He got the nickname the Indiana Jones of psychology because he went right up to Greenland and sat down with the Inuit and across to Kenya and sat down with the Masai Mara. And was just asking the question, do these things make sense in your culture? So he had translators and they went to various other places as well and was asking, what sense do these make in your culture? And effectively really got the sense that these are at least comprehensible around the world. They might be emphasized in different ways. There might be different ways of looking at them, but nevertheless people do understand them. So that's really lovely. I think if I was a poet, I could just write some poems about those 6. But as psychologists, we're awkward, so we want these things to be measurable, we want them to be empirical, we want to be able to look at them in various scientific ways. And so what happened next was they gathered 55 of what Martin Seligman called the world's leading psychologists together. I mean, he didn't invite me, so still hurts, actually. But he gathered them all together and he says, okay, now let's look at the psychological literature, the scientific literature, and see if see what's been studied. And at that point, they came up with 24 what they called character strengths that they think fit into this model, but behind which there is empirical evidence, and that's what it looked like. Few things to say on this. So, firstly, spirituality here is also often called faith. So, when I study it in a Christian context, I replace the word spirituality with faith. Some of them go by different names. So judgment here, for example, it is also open-mindedness, or you might call it critical thinking. Passion is sometimes called vitality or zest. So each of them has multiple different ways of referring to them. And these are sort of natural ways of referring to some quite profound psychological literature. So when you start to dip into the psychological literature, what you discover is that, for example, so earlier on we were talking about how do you work with someone who has a radically different view from yours, like creationism, for example, and the judgment literature gets very heavily into something called integrative complexity, which is how we as human beings relate to other people who have really radically different views than ours. And so although this just looks like a list of words, and in a sense it's fine to read it at that level, firstly, the overall model in itself, I think there's 400 academic peer-reviewed articles about it now, researching it in various different ways. There's probably about 100 critical pieces about it, so philosophers sort of haggling about how useful it is. But then if you take each individual thing around it, you end up with literally thousands of pieces of research. One example, for example, was if you'd looked up forgiveness in the 1980s as a piece of psychological research, you would have got a handful of papers. And then thanks to various scholars, one of whom is called Everett Worthington in Virginia, you will now find about 2,000 pieces of research have been done on forgiveness and what it does for psychological, what its constituents are, what it does socially, what kind of interventions we can develop to come to to a place of forgiveness, etc. Plus many Christians actually looking at the notion of sacred forgiveness. What does it mean for us to be forgiven by God? Can we forgive without a sense of having been forgiven, etc.? So all those kind of questions in there. And that's just forgiveness. So if you think that that's multiplied for all these things here. The other thing they did is that they developed a psychometric. The psychometric is on this website here, the VIA Institute on Character. If you put that into Google, VIA Institute on Character, you can do the psychometric if you wish to. And it measures these 24 character strengths in a self-report kind of way. And that psychometric now has been completed by, I think, 8 million people. I say I think because every time, basically, one person completes the psychometric every 15 seconds. So we have data from people all over the world, millions of people, and it's been analysed in all kinds of different ways. And so it's gathering a good body of evidence. I was talking to someone earlier about some of their experience of strengths-based psychology. And this is the only psychometric like that, psychometric measure, where you can really get under the hood and you can know what the stats are and you can critique it and things like that. Because many others are sort of owned by people like Gallup or other commercial entities who say, we don't want you coming anywhere near our psychometric and getting it wrong, whereas this one has been explored in all kinds of different ways. So the best way to get to grips with it, and this is where the workshop session begins, feel free to groan in a moment, I'd like you to go and find someone in the room who is high risk for you. What I mean is either they're a bit intimidating or you haven't spoken to them yet over the last 2 days. So take a deep breath, go and find that person. When you've found them and sat down next to you, I'll tell you the conversation I'd like you to have in and around these things. There's no trapdoors, it's not nasty, don't worry. Off we go. So I'd like to have a very, very quick conversation with the person next to you. It's going to be a two-way conversation. And I'd like you to talk about, one of you to begin with, just for a few minutes, maybe 1-2 minutes, talks about a moment, perhaps in the last week or so, where you feel you've been at your best. Now, if you're a Christian, you can talk about, when have I been most like Jesus, even if I didn't know it this week? When have I actually performed or been the person I would really like to be? I'd like you just to describe it. And I'd like the person who's listening simply to notice which of these strengths, the ones around the outside, they notice in that story. Now, it's not a competition. You're not going for all 24. Sometimes I encounter people telling their story to try and fit things in. Just come up. So if I was going to go with this week, let me think, when have I been at my best? So I had a colleague who was quite upset about something this week, and I was really busy, but instead of saying, I'm too busy, go away, I got on the phone to them, said, come and meet with me in my office, and we had a good conversation for half an hour and tried to resolve some of the issues that were going on. It's not a particularly dramatic story. It's not like me. It's not the moment I candidated for sainthood, is it really? But you might be able to notice some of it. So there's I think it was a bit of self-control there. I wanted to do stuff, but I kind of kept away from it. There's a bit of social intelligence and kindness in it, in the sense that I had to try and understand what she was saying and be kind to give her that time. I think for me there was a little bit of persistence in it, because everything in me just wanted to get back to all the emails I had piling up, but actually I persisted in having the meeting. So that just might be some of the ideas that go on there. So 3 minutes each way. So you tell a story, other person spots strengths in you. They then tell a story, you spot strengths in them. Any questions on the exercise? The most difficult thing of this for a lot of people is actually just thinking of the occurrence. So you don't have to go dramatic. If you really, really get stuck, given that many of you are church leaders, sometimes you will find that you've found it easier to spot strengths in other, goodness in other people. So if you find I'm just really stuck on this, then maybe talk about someone in your congregation and what good you've seen in them lately. You can do it that way. Although I have to say, if you do that, you're copping out a little bit of the exercise, okay? So off you go, have a go, see how you get on, and then I'll be interested to see how you find it. So 3 minutes one way, 3 minutes the other way. Off you go. Okay, so very quick exercise. Maybe haven't even given you enough time to really make sense of what went on there. But two things go on. Either you're spotting strengths in somebody else, or you're having your strengths spotted. So that's ideally what went on. I long since gave up the illusion that people ever have the conversation I want them to have, so it may be that things have gone in all kinds of different directions. But what did you make of it? What was it like to have your strengths spotted? What was it like to spot strengths? How did you find it? Very agreeable. Okay, thank you. Affirming. Yeah, very nice. Lovely word. That's right. And was that when you were talking about yours? Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So some people, quite a lot of people will say that with this exercise, and they'll say, well, it's almost like it's sort of socially dangerous or ethically wrong to sort of say good things about yourself. I've certainly recognised that in myself at times as well. Yeah.
More colours in the rainbow than I thought there would be.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I really like about this, is for me it's given me not just a language but a perspective to spot these things in other people when I see them. That previously I just didn't think about it quite as much as I did before I encountered this. That's right. So more nuance, more language. And I think if you're going to take away anything, even if the rest of the science doesn't make sense to you, I think just the idea of having a list of good words about other people I think is a helpful idea. Yeah. Yeah. Patience is missing, yes, you're right. Anything else missing?
Is compassion comes by this?
Yeah, so most people put compassion in kindness. Yeah. Although, again, there's problems with that too, but there you go. I'll get to patience in a second. And any of them there you wouldn't put there. So any of them you'd be like, what is that doing there?
Where's humour in transcendence?
So humour actually connects to joy. One of my favourite philosophers, Søren Kierkegaard, used to say that humour was the beginning of the spiritual life, because in humour we look at who we are and who we'd like to be, and we laugh at the difference. and so I think there is, when you look at the research on humour, there is something pretty transcendent about humour when it's used correctly.
Humility appears twice. It's the blue circle on the right, and then it's down there as well.
Humility? Oh, humanity. Oh, so yeah, so that's, yeah, sorry. But that's the fault of my colouring there, so. So yeah, sorry.
Social IQ feels as if it could do with some other patterns first.
Yeah. So I have to say that social IQ and I think sort of leadership maybe are the two that I'm least happy with being in there. So social IQ covers all what psychologists would call the hot intelligences. So personal intelligence, emotional intelligence, social intelligence. So it's rather than the analytical intelligences which tend to appear up here, it's the one that's about when you're in a social context, can you read what other people want, what they're after, what their intentions are? Can you spot what their emotions are so you can empathize with them? But if I'm really honest, I'd be quite happy for that to be folded into love, really. You know, I feel like love in its fully orbed sense. You know, and Paul says, you know, the love of Christ is so high and wide and deep and long and, you know, it's all this. You kind of get the feeling there's a lot in love, really. So, but I mean, it's useful, it's there. But yeah, it's a question. Now, the question about patience, just to kind of pick that one up, is one of the criteria by which they chose these. There were 12 criteria originally used, and one of them was a concept that they called non-redundancy. And that was the idea that they didn't want anything on there that could already be accounted for by a combination of the others. And there's some differences on this. So some people would say that patience, for example, if you take self-control and a bit of hope and a little bit of persistence, you end up with something that looks a bit like patience. There's quite disagreement about that in the literature. The other one Christians often ask about that I'm quite intrigued by is gentleness. Doesn't appear in there either. So if we think that is one of the fruit of the Spirit. And for me, gentleness comes close to sort of humility, because humility has a kind of serenity to it. So it's a sort of caring humility, something like that. There's just another one that occurred to me. But there's a few, basically, that as Christians we would celebrate that don't appear.
Passion is quite a two-edged thing.
It really is.
Remember in Pilgrim's Progress, there are two children, passion and patience. And passion is definitely not a good thing.
Well, so that's really, really interesting. But if you look up something like zeal in Scripture, zeal for the Lord, etc., and as you'll see in a moment, all strengths that we ever talk about, all of them can be dualized, can be split into this is great and here's where it really goes wrong, including some of the ones that we quite like. Anything else on that exercise just before we move on? Yeah.
Comment about boastfulness. Is there a cultural overlay there? I mean, I'm consciously Britain, but
Yeah.
we are pretty modest anyway.
Yes.
And I meet some of my colleagues from America. Quite different.
Yes. Do you know the other place I found this? So one of my PhD students did a lot of work translating all of this into Arabic and running it in the Gulf states. And the interesting thing is she found exactly the reverse, particularly with men in Arab culture, that they didn't want to talk about weaknesses, but they were quite happy to talk about strengths. And one of the things that she did was basically retranslate all the counselling service that she had in the university she was working in Arabic, into positive things. So they weren't going to go and see a psychologist for anxiety, they were going to see them to learn their bravery. They were no longer going to learn about depression, they were going to learn how to be hopeful and push forward. And weirdly, she created basically the first kind of form of counselling she'd found that could work with Arab men, that they were actually prepared to turn up and do it. And so you're right, I think there are definitely cultural differences in those things, without a doubt.
In that respect, it's interesting because I've done a few things on the Enneagram.
Yeah.
And that was supposed to come from Persia. And that very much looks at strengths and weaknesses as different aspects of the same thing.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And we'll get to that with this in a second as well, so you'll see how this makes sense in those ways. So what did it... the word feel probably is... It might not be the best word here, but what emotion did you notice occurred in the room when you started talking about your strengths, when you or even in the story you told? What kind of emotion was involved in some of those things? What did you notice, not just about the content, but about the process of the conversation? A sense of satisfaction. Okay, yeah, very good. Sorry? Say that again. Pride. In the healthy way, do you mean? Yeah, so in the kind of good way? Yep. Okay, pride is one of those words that Christians get in a bit of a mess about, along with ambition as well, I think because there's actually more than one concept knocking around in those kind of ideas.
Sense of being valued by being well listened to.
Yeah, so sense of value. So we had the word affirmation earlier, didn't we? Kind of sense of being seen, being valued. Now, what's interesting about some of this research is that this research has gone into the workplace and looked at what some people call positive appraisals. So if you have an appraisal in the workplace, and usually it's that moment where you're given you tell them what your goal was last year. I've got mine coming up in 2 weeks. Here's my goals for last year. Have you made them or have you not? There was a big movement in psychology towards something that they call positive appraisal. And basically, the idea was rather than looking at what you've done wrong and what you have to do, the conversation begins, you can look at that stuff too, but it begins from a point of what have you contributed? What have you done well? And what they found with that is that when people went through a positive appraisal process, they then reported all kinds of outcomes as a result. So motivation went up, positive emotion went up, their ability to learn in the workplace increases, their sense of energy, their sense that time went quicker. So when people were positively motivated, time, a day went very, very quickly. They found that people worked in ways that other people respected more in them. And so positive appraisal led to all these kind of outcomes. And probably one of the most famous pieces of research from the psychological angle on character strengths has been research on something called signature strengths. And this gets very, very close to Paul's understanding of the body of Christ. And what this kind of implies is it says that you could look at this as a list of things to do, but actually what really happens here is that all of us in this room have a slightly different combination of these things that we peak on. In other words, they come very, very naturally to us. It's almost as if they were put in us at birth. And for those of us who are Christians and came to Jesus, it's like they kind of got fired up and awoken in us in that moment. So, for example, I would guess that many people in this room, because you're here and because you're also church leaders, probably have quite a strong love of learning. You love learning things, and you love sharing what you learn with other people, I'd guess. But I would imagine that for some of you, that would take a sort of very critical edge in terms of, very logical and thinking about whether things are right or wrong. For others, it would have a very hopeful edge. I've learnt this, I'm going to share it with enthusiasm, so it brings hope to other people. Other people would take it very much down the pastoral angle. Other people would take it down the motivational route. I've got some great things to go and speak to my congregation about, or something I'm going to take into a meeting. And the idea of signature strengths really is the idea that if we can spot which of these we just seem to have been naturally gifted with, we sort of receive them as grace. We didn't earn them, they kind of fell naturally to us, and we learn to use those signature strengths, then consistently what comes up when you look at all the research about it is that basically people who learn to use their signature strengths in a way that's curious, how could I use my wisdom in this situation, but also kind. If I fail to use it well, I'll sort of try again next time, I won't get all judgmental about it. Those people seem to live with enormous sense of life satisfaction, so enormous sense of joy and effusiveness and happiness and positive emotion. And the interesting thing about positive emotion from a psychological point of view is that positive emotion is actually much more effective than we usually think it is. So I have to say that I have, because I'm not American, have a sort of knee-jerk response against the idea of happiness, even though I spend so much time studying it. And one of the reasons for that is that positive emotion actually isn't just one thing. So when people talk about happiness, I think about blissfulness and people who've just gone a bit crazy and smiley, no matter what the context is. There's nothing more irritating than that. But positivity from a psychological point of view is really the name that's given to all positive emotions. And the thing you have to keep in mind is that there are really no negative or positive emotions. All our emotions are doing something for us. But the emotions we call them negative because they have very strong action tendencies attached to them. So fear wants to run away, anger wants to fight, sadness wants to retreat and collapse, shame wants to hide. And so we call them negative emotions because they immediately they kind of motivate us to do something. And the reason for that is generally they're there for our survival. So, if you're stepping out in front of the road and a truck is coming towards you, you don't want to be really deeply curious about the registration plate and the colour of the truck driver's eyes. You want to be scared enough to get out of the way really, really quick. The danger with negative emotions like that, therefore, for example, in the workplace, is there is a tendency for bad leaders, or bad bosses, if you like, to want to motivate people through negative experience, through stressing them out, through scaring them, through making them ashamed, etc., because you get very, very reliable responses out of those emotions. You don't get trust, you don't get sustainability, you don't get happy teams that collaborate and work together, but you do at least get people to do as they're told in the short term. Positive emotions, on the other hand, Barbara Fredrickson, leading kind of emotional scientist, she just gives some examples of positive emotions. So she said positive emotions are things like this: amusement, having a laugh together; pride in the right way, didn't we do well today? Or, wow, isn't that amazing? Inspiration, gosh, I'd really like to do that. Serenity. Serenity is, I think, one of the ones we often miss. A few years back, I was sat on the sofa watching cartoons with my two young boys who were just sort of toddlers in those days. And this thought suddenly occurred to me, hang on a sec, what is this feeling I've got? Oh, I'm happy. I'm serene. I'm just enjoying being with them. So serenity is a form of positivity. Plus joy when things go well, when things are fantastic. Hope when things might be tough, but we know there's a better future. Love when we step out in sort of deep, positive connection with other people. Interest, I'm curious about that. Gratitude, I'm thankful and I'm grateful for what's going on. And those are the kind Barbara Fredrickson would say, as opposed to negative emotions that have strong action tendencies, positive emotions, they don't have an immediate action tendency attached to them quite often. Joy, you might want to leap up and down, but after that, I'm not quite sure. And what they actually seem to do is, firstly, they broaden our awareness. So when you're being loving, or you're being grateful, or you're being interested, very often you're open to new information, new things go on. This is why if you want to persuade creationists to change their mind about things, the first thing you shouldn't do is you shouldn't threaten them or make them feel scared or make them feel like you're about to destroy their meaning system. Because the moment they go into kind of negative emotion, they'll lock down on it, which is a different kind of pride. But what positive emotions do is they open us up to the things around us and they build resilience in us. So actually, if you've had time in the morning, perhaps meditating on the love of God, spending time reading scripture in a serene way, thinking about the joyfulness of heaven, being grateful for the people in the world around you that God has placed there, that actually sets you up to be much, much more resilient to the things that are going to come your way that day. And the interesting thing is many of those positive emotions, I haven't got a slide on this, but just as an aside, they seem to have an effect sometimes 2 or 3 people removed from us. So when you look at studies of social networks, if someone, for example, has on their own been praying lovingly that morning, before we even add in God supernaturally doing things, not only will their family know, but the people their family has contact with will also pick something up, and sometimes even the people their family have had contact with will actually benefit a little bit from the fact that you were having a loving moment with God that morning. But even more than that, when you look at meta-analyses of thousands of different studies in organizational life, it would suggest that if you have an organization where positive emotion is high, so keep what the link is, so using character strengths leads to high positive emotions like this. High positive emotions like this actually then have an effect on the world around us. So for me, this is kind of like how fruit, if you like, turns into salting and lighting our society. Here's what happens. So staff with higher positive emotion have lower staff turnover, lower reports of emotional exhaustion, fewer work absences, fewer hospital visits, fewer fatalities, believe it or not. I was talking to an engineering firm a few months back, and they were telling me that they know if their CEO is doing a good job by just looking at their health and safety record, because that goes up and down depending on how the organisation is feeling. Less substance abuse, so people don't go home and self-medicate because the workplace is such a terrible place to be. And faster, so that's lower length of illness recovery. So people, when they are off, they're back to work quicker. And then other things go up in a positive emotion situation. So firstly, unsurprisingly, people just feel happier to be at work. They enjoy doing what they do. They're more motivated, so they get on with things. People tend to be willing to hang out with one another outside of work. So this is where people say, we love being together, let's do a running club, let's do a choir. I was talking to a group of teaching schools the other day who were telling me that they've set up a choir of their teachers that kind of meets on a Wednesday night after school, and it's this sense of we enjoy being together and enjoy singing together. Interestingly, they're singing quite a lot of worship songs because the person who leads it is a worship leader in a local church. More volunteerism, so you don't have those awful meetings where we say someone needs to do this and everybody stares at their shoelaces and finds them so fascinating. People are like, yeah, no, I can do that. I'll get on with that. Greater collaboration, particularly when resources are scarce. So quite often I find that when organisations are scared, I've worked in the NHS, I've worked in various universities, and when there's sort of government funding cuts and things like that, there's fear runs through the organisation, and the temptation is for people in the organisation to sort of compete with one another for scarce resources, whereas if there's a good sense of hope, gratitude, love, enjoyment knocking about, people will go, I know we're both after this, let's collaborate, shall we, and see what we can do together. It's more likely to happen. Also better decision making. So some of my research over the last few years has been on dentists. So we looked at kind of dentists and what makes them stressed and how they find difficulty. And one of the things we found is you might be scared of your dentist, but actually your dentist also might be a bit scared of you, particularly if there's very complex things they need to do and they have to make hard decisions. And what we found that if they're feeling more confident, more hopeful, more grateful, etc., that actually their decision making, their clinical decision making improves. More innovation. So people say, I've got an idea. Should we try this? Let's see if we can do something here. And interestingly, even salaries go up. Now, I thought this was a crazy finding. The science is pretty solid on it. It's in this Sonia Lyubomirsky article at the bottom here. And I've presented it many, many times in the public sector and thought, I'm really embarrassed to present this to the police or to some school on a sort of inner city estate or something like that. But over and over and over again, even though I present it in a sort of slightly awkward way, people will immediately come up to me and correct me and tell me a story about something that happened in their workplace that was good and that actually meant that they, things were more financially lucrative as a result. And it was often to do with some kind of hope arrived or some connectedness occurred in love between different people. And the thing I've sort of learnt really is it seems to me that it's not that we wait for the money to arrive and then we work out what to do. It's like if you have hope and love and a real sense of the good you want to do in the world, sometimes that just seems to attract money. For some people go, okay, that's a place to invest. And finally, longevity. So people don't just retire and go, thank goodness for that, and pop their clogs. They feel like there's a life beyond work as well. And they say, okay, there we go, we'll live longer from there. So character leads to positive emotion. Positive emotion leads to all kinds of outcomes. These are just the workplace outcomes. We could talk about health outcomes. We could talk about all kinds of other things. But that's just one of those. And the interesting thing is that when you begin to look at these sort of individual strengths that are around here, some of them are actually much more closely related to life satisfaction, which is the cognitive version of happiness, the cognitive version of positive emotion, more than others. If you had to take a guess, which strengths, so the ones around the outside, which ones would you think were most related to life satisfaction? So this comes out reliably across the world, that when people measure their strengths and then measure life satisfaction, there's certain ones that come up pretty standard here. So gratitude, yep, connected to life satisfaction. Self-control. Hope, yeah. Love. Anything else? Wonder, maybe? Let me show you. So it's these 5 consistently come out. Now, it's a slightly trick question because all of them are associated to life satisfaction. But these are the 5 that are most highly correlated, both in correlational studies when you take big populations of people and correlate between the two, but also in intervention studies when you say which of these are we going to target and which of them seem to work best to sort of increase people's level. So curiosity, a sense of interest and wonder at the world. Wonder doesn't get included, interestingly, but that's another story. I won't get into it now. Gratitude, hope, passion, which is basically the real desire to get into things and get on with stuff and being passionate about life, zestful, and love. Just because there's been a bit of a theme of environmentalism and climate change going around, let me just mention one piece of research we're doing at Lincoln at the moment, looked at all these strengths with regard to which of them relate best to positive environmental behaviours. So when someone lives in a really sort of environmentally sustainable way, which of these really seem to contribute to it? And the kind of we did a structural equation model and kind of worked out which ones seem to really fit. And actually what we found is that most people, in our sample at least, so we had a sample of about 500 people who were high in positive environmental behaviours, were also very high in curiosity. So they had quite a strong sense of open-mindedness about what the world was about and how they could help and what things would go on, but also high in judgment. And judgment here is the ability to think. So it's a kind of an intellectual, penetratingness. And so one of my PhD students, Beth Warman, has just designed, and she's sort of trialing it in various forms, an approach to teaching environmental positive behaviours that draws on character strengths. I mean, it draws on all of them, but it particularly targets how could we make people curious and how could we get them to think well and consider different kind of sources of information. And as I said a moment ago, this is what then turns up in multiple strengths interventions. So when people say we want to develop an intervention that makes people happier, if it gets people curious, gets them grateful, hopeful, and passionate. Interestingly, in this particular study that I'm referring to here, they decided to ditch love and go with humour. Which I don't think they should have done that personally, but the reason they did that is because, this is being videoed, one of the researchers is one of the world experts on humour, basically. So unsurprisingly, suddenly humour pops up. But it did work, and it did sort of generate good things. There's then also all kinds of literature on just developing individual character strengths. So these are just a few of the examples of some fantastic work on curiosity. Forgiveness and humility have got some really, believe it or not, there is a humility workbook. If you go to, if you look at Worthington, Everett Worthington, put humility, you can go to his website. You can download forgiveness and humility workbooks. Take a few days to work through. I have to say, we've tried to replicate his humility workbook a few times. I've never been able to make anyone more humble by doing it. but actually they've seemed to have got some quite good results. And I actually think what's going on there is because he's in the States and he's in Virginia, I think the sort of the greatest preponderance of Christians in his sample means that humility means more to them than it does, say, to me doing it with a room full of... So when I survey my students at Lincoln University, about 10% of them would call themselves theists. So that's kind of the standard cohort of psychologists. Maybe they don't have a background in humility being deeply important. And humility is one of the most wonderful areas of research now. It seems like the longer Donald Trump is in office, the more research on humility seems to be done. I don't know if there's, I don't know what the connection is there. But then also, so this is my course here, so the character course, .com. So if you go to that website, you can give us your email address, and as soon as it all goes live properly, you'll get the link. And just to say a little bit about what we do. So basically, we chose 8 character strengths to target. It's when you've spent 3 years designing something, you get to the end of it, it's, I wish I'd done something else. They wish you'd done others as well. But effectively what we did was, so I chose them based on the psychology literature, so based on the idea of which strengths really seem to really do well in terms of giving people a sense of well-being. So that was hope, love, gratitude, curiosity, and humour. I then put learning in right at the beginning, partly because I wanted to kind of address the idea that I think some Christians, particularly if we're sort of evangelical and conservative, will have a bit of nervousness about works righteousness around doing sort of spiritual exercises like this. And I just wanted to frame it as a learning experiment. So I'm not saying, this will make you more godly necessarily. I'm just saying, just try them out and see where God meets you in the process of doing them. We put in persistence because there are actually a few studies, particularly in Germany, in Arab nations, where persistence comes up quite highly as one of the things that really improves people's lives. And we put in forgiveness because I just felt it was so theologically important that actually, and weirdly, it's the session on forgiveness that really seems to land. That's the one that everybody refers to as the most challenging one, even though from our point of view, forgiveness is the session that we do most inadequately, because in a 20-minute video and a quick discussion, actually covering all the nature of what forgiveness is really hard to do. And so it's based on the psychology of those things, plus then a sort of biblical lexicography of where they appear in Greek, and tracing the kind of line all the way, particularly through the New Testament, in some cases into the Old Testament. I mean, it's really just a sort of thematic analysis of when these words show up in Scripture, what are they doing and why are they going on. One of the most interesting things, particularly, is gratitude. Because one of the things I hadn't realized until I started putting this course together is that the notion of gratitude, or perhaps more accurately, thankfulness. So quite often we're grateful for something, but we're thankful to someone. So the idea of thankfulness to God. In Paul's epistles, for example, it appears there's 53 really clear occurrences of thankfulness. And it makes you realize that you can't really understand Paul unless you understand how grateful and thankful he is, and how much that's part of his appreciation of grace. So he's thanking, God for what Jesus has done. He's thanking his congregations for who they are. Well, apart from the Galatians, where he just jumps in and gets really mad right at the start. He's thankful for the giftedness that God has given him. So he's even sort of thankful for his own giftedness in that sense, and what the calling that he's been given 53 times. And then when you look in all the other epistles, Peter, James, John, Jude, etc., 0 occurrences of the word thankfulness. Just doesn't happen even once. And I think it's still there in kind of thematically, if you like, but it's not there as an actual word. And the interesting thing I found about that is that quite often I kind of encounter, particularly in academic circles, this idea that Jesus is almost like God's hippie son who went off to college and came back with all these sort of ideas about love and grace. And then Paul is this sort of I think it's Nietzsche we have to blame for this, and it's this kind of Nietzschean guy who is very fundamentalist, and he's homophobic, and he's prejudiced, and he's a chauvinist, and all that kind of thing. But when you start to read him through the lens of gratitude, you're like, that's just not the way this is. He's deeply suffused in the grace of God, and everything he's doing is always part of that gratefulness to God, gratefulness for himself, gratefulness to the people around him. And so that's the character course. It's all there, 8 sessions. It'll be up on the website. I don't know when. We were supposed to have done it by now, but we're still working on it. But we've done it in the brown paper bag version, and we're going to see what happens next. Just to say what the outcome was, so we've just crunched the data on about 1,000 people, and we measured character change, and we measured spiritual transformation, various different aspects of relationship to God. And we also measured well-being, so various measures of how meaningful is your life, how good are your relationships, etc. And we got one of those awful situations where absolutely everything correlates with everything, which means it's like finding nothing, basically. It's like, and so we now have all kinds of transformations to do and try and work out what that means. One of the reasons for that is that we actually found that, and I had been warned about this, is that generally speaking, Christians tend to produce a negative skew when they answer self-report items on character strength. So what that means is that everybody's piling into the upper end of the scoring system. Are you loving? Yes. Are you humble? Yes. So it kind of all ends up there. And we tried to correct for that by having something called a social desirability scale, which is basically a scale that involves quite a lot of quite ridiculous statements that no one in their right mind would say yes to. I am always loving and never ever feel resentful and things like that. And unfortunately, that was high too. So we're now trying to work out what do we do with that and how do we make that work. But that's where that ended up. So you're very, very welcome to look that up and take that away with you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how character strengths, that's the sort of basic setup. Should we just pause for any questions or anything you want to flag up at this moment? Yeah.
Just going back to the humility idea, I think in the business literature, there's a lot of work around the fact that humility is an attribute that certain business gurus would argue set the really great leaders apart.
That's right, correct, yeah. And that's what inspired me to do. So are you thinking of Jim Collins and other people like that? Yeah, and that's what inspired me to study humility in the first place. And what's quite cool for me is, as a result of having done that research, I did a piece of research that was funded by the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, looking at humility in academic professors. Did find some. And what we found was that if the academic you report to has humility, and in this case we're talking about intellectual humility, so you rate them as they're willing to listen, they don't double down on stupid opinions, they don't dominate you with their things, but they're willing to listen and assert and all that kind of thing, is that we found that generally speaking, if the person you report to is humble, then you are much more likely to bring your best to work as well. So you'll be happier, you'll be more motivated, and you're also much more likely to bring whatever your strengths are to the table in that situation. So I put together a course called The Humble Leader, and I tried to sell it commercially, like just me, people buying me out of the university. I just couldn't get anybody to pick it up at all. So I just changed the title. All the content remained the same, and I called it The Effective Leader. And then basically, I've been to international banks, worked with the police, worked with football teams, and basically my strategy now is that I talk about courage first, and everyone's like, yeah, we need to be courage, take risks. And I say, but if you want to be sustainable, the other thing you should think about is humility. And for about the first 3 minutes, everybody scoffs. But usually by the time I've finished, everybody's agreeing with me. Yeah, we definitely need that here. The other trick I've found, and I owe this to Erasmus, because it's something that Erasmus came up with originally, is that Erasmus is often quoted as saying, you should praise a king for virtues he does not have, because then he will get to thinking about them and begin to develop them. And so what I always do in a room is I find the most arrogant person, and I look for the moment when they display just the tiniest moment of humility, and then I name it, and they look shocked. Everybody else laughs. And then suddenly, actually, humility becomes a thing in the room. People start thinking about it. So, yeah, I'm a psychologist. I'm sneaky. But yeah, I really welcomed that. Thanks for bringing that in. Yeah.
The characteristic spirituality, do you ever get any pushback from people who say there isn't a spiritual world?
Yeah.
The only one that you
So you know what's really curious about that is I've often had people who, say if I'm coaching them or I'm leading a session, will point at that and go, I want none of that. In fact, I had one training session where someone stood up and swore at everyone and said, I don't want any of it. Probably looked me up online or something and knew as a Christian, I don't want to hear any of that nonsense, blah, 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 blah. 3 days of training together in the same room. And by the end of it, he's saying, I think I got that wrong, and I'm wondering maybe I should check out my local church. So it's kind of like, you do get some pushback. And for some people, it's really the sign that they're on the edge of, it's actually really starting to threaten them a little bit, and maybe they're actually on the edge of beginning to take it more seriously than they previously had. Equally, I'm thinking of someone I coached who in the first session said, yes, spirituality is my lowest strength and I'm quite happy with it there. Thank you very much. But it was actually one of the main emphases of what he was doing by the end of our coaching. And that's not because I'm pushing it just seemed to emerge for some reason. Yeah.
A few minutes ago, when you were talking about the findings from your program,
Yeah.
You talked about there had been some evidence, and you called it character change.
Yes, yeah.
And I just wonder about that. I mean, are you not really talking about changed behaviours, which we can learn, rather than any kind of deeper change to your character?
Yeah. So you're stumbling into probably the most complicated psychological question we could possibly ask.
By mistake.
So I could talk about all the kind of different ways that psychologists can potentially measure character and whether it is a trait or whether it's a state. But I think rather than go into all that, I'll just say yes, I recognise the limitation. You're correct. Yep.
Sorry, I noticed amongst your 8, you didn't include prudence. Now, prudence, as I recall from my study of Aristotle and the Thomist scheme of virtues, is a kind of sine qua non for all
Correct.
the cardinal virtues.
Yes.
Because it is there to regulate them and make sure that none of them are carried to the extremes to which they can be carried.
Yes.
And I wondered why you'd left that out.
Yes. So you're absolutely correct. That in Aristotle and in Aquinas as well, the idea of prudence, prudentia, phronesis, it's basically this idea of the wisdom to know, which strength should I be pushing forward right now? To what extent should I be using a virtue in a particular situation? And actually, this model is agnostic about whether there is a cardinal virtue or not. So actually, what you find empirically is that there's some people are saying it's prudence, other people say self-control is the way, other people are saying it's wisdom. And generally, again, what you tend to find, in psychology at least, it's the experts in a particular character strength are arguing that theirs is the most important. But I think often in research that we've done, in place of prudentia in that way, we tend to use reflection. Sometimes we would call it mindfulness. With Christians, we'll often call it prayer, which is a moment to sit and think and reflect, what should I be doing here? I'll get onto that in a second, actually. So I'm just aware of time, so let me fly on a little bit. So the other interesting thing, and this might help some of you pastorally, is that I'm now involved in a series of studies about how character strengths can be used to improve mental health. So how not only can we understand bad mental health by using character strengths, but also how could we improve it, what might help here. So I'm going to fly through this a little bit quickly, but just to say in the literature, there's really 3 models of how character strengths help us with psychological well-being. So if you imagine, here's a psychological distress, some kind of mental health problem. Here's the various causal factors, and that includes everything: genetics, socialization, culture, socioeconomic deprivation, faulty thinking, behavioral patterns, etc. But whatever that is, it leads to psychological distress. Psychological distress, mental health problems don't have one cause. They have many, many different things come together. Three models have been proposed. So the first one is the idea of strengths as mediators. So what this means is that if you have someone who is deeply distressed psychologically, you can do what I used to do with people when I was talking about dialectical behavior therapy, is I can try and work out what strength does this person need and how do we build that. And there's some evidence that if we can do that at the right time, in the right place, that actually might in some way get in the way of psychological distress happening. In other words, so this is really what we call the resilience literature. So it allows people to say, yes, I'm facing these terrible causal things, but I've actually learned the strengths that mean this won't turn into a clinical depression, social anxiety, something diagnostic like that. So it's really asking the question, what's missing here and how would we insert it? Do you want to ask a question? Is it a quick one?
On your slide, you've got two, these are down as moderators, and the next slide is about...
Have I swapped it? So it should be this way round. Yeah, this is the right way round. So what happened was this next one, which is the research by Bob McGrath, this article is actually called Strengths as Moderators. So I think what happened was I just got the words the wrong way round. So strengths as moderators, therefore, effectively really says, takes more of a probabilistic approach. It says these are the causal factors that cause psychological stress, but even alongside that, we can develop strengths that might reduce that psychological distress. So this is something I quite often will use, say, with depressed people, where you might be depressed, but actually you can still be really persistent. One of my depressed clients tiled his bathroom 1 tile a day over 6 weeks, and by the end of it, he had a beautiful bathroom that really improved his life and made him ever so slightly less depressed. It didn't completely cancel his depression, but it was certainly a lovely step forward. And so this is the idea of strengths really as moderators. So they help some aspect of it, but they don't block it out entirely. So we would say, what more? What else could you do? And here's my favourite approach. This is the really sort of subversive way that strength psychology can now address mental health problems. Is that it basically has an idea that mental health problems could actually be conceptualized as too much or too little of certain strengths. Like that might actually be the best way of thinking about some of them anyway. So let me show you what that means. So this basically comes from the idea, so we're getting close to Aristotle here, of the golden mean, which means that with any of the strengths, using them too much or too little leads us into problems. As we increase them, the benefits slowly go away. So if you do a gratitude study, if you're doing a gratitude intervention, you will find after a while, it gives you a big kick for the first few weeks, and then after that, it just levels off. It just is what it is. The other thing that happens, though, is over time, the costs to it increase. So the longer you practice a particular strength, the more the costs of doing it go up as well. So there's a sort of famous gratitude program that I actually did for myself and worked through. And I found that 1 week was fine, 2 weeks was okay, but by 3 weeks, I was really starting to feel, well, basically all the opposite of gratitude started to come over me. I started to notice my resentment and my annoyance, and I really wanted to do something else. So the costs are going up. And what that means is you end up with this sort of algebraic sum of an inverted U relationship, which is basically there is this kind of optimum place where things work. So let me explain this a bit better. Allow my slide to reset itself. How are we doing for time? So we would actually do this as an exercise, but we haven't really got time. But it's a bit where you would talk for a moment about you at your not quite so best lately. You know, when have you been at your worst? So if I was going to think about this this week, this has been quite a nice week, really. So it's a bit. So before Christmas, when I was feeling a bit stressed and like trying to get to the end, I'd often found that, you know, both me and my wife, we just couldn't be bothered to parent anymore. So we come home from work and, you know, our kids were staying up too late and everybody was getting a bit moody. And, you know, so that's as our worst, let's say. Okay. So if we were going to talk about that, one way of thinking about it, and I actually find quite a nice model of sin at the behavioral level, at least, which is quite often we view that maybe there were strengths we have that we were underusing. So we're actually quite wise as parents, but actually we went for shallowness. Parenting actually involves quite a bit of bravery, maybe persistence, but actually we got fragile and couldn't be bothered to do it. Instead of self-control, we got a bit self-indulgent. It's kind of like, oh, well, it doesn't, if they stay up, you know, a couple of hours, an hour late, it doesn't matter, it'll be fine. And so it's just this whole sense of sort of things not going well. But then the other thing that I think we don't talk about quite so much, so this is strengths underuse. So you can spot sometimes there's a strength I have that for whatever reason I haven't brought it to the table in this situation. The other thing we think about less is strengths overuse. So these are the moments where something really, really good, it's good about you, it's something you use often and you use it naturally and you use it easily, you just pull out to too high a degree, too much, perhaps in the wrong context, and suddenly something that's really good becomes a liability. I mean, I think about how quite often I feel in our culture now, kind of forgiveness has got to the point of almost we have to forgive anything. Anything's acceptable. You're not even allowed to express a moral judgment about some things. You must have people, where should we go? So, there must be people in your congregation, for example, who overuse kindness to the point of intrusiveness. You have those people, walk into church and they say, "How are you?" And you're like, "Fine." They're like, "No, how are you?" Like, "Fine, no, how are you?" And you think, well, I was fine until this conversation started. And it's basically, kindness becomes a way of them almost beating down the doors of your quite reasonable desire to keep yourself to yourself in certain situations. And so you can see a lot of these kind of things. And I find this a very, very useful way of thinking about kind of mental health problems as well. So what we've been doing in Lincoln and what some of my other colleagues have been doing around the world as well is beginning to look at some of the major mental health diagnoses through this lens of strengths, overuse and underuse. In other words, what's too much, what's too little, and what do we end up with as a result? So social anxiety disorder, massive problem among undergraduate students at the moment. And in our research and in research that's been done by Pavel Friedlin and his colleagues in Israel, there's various things to comment on here, but let me just talk about this one. It is that very often we found that in students with high social anxiety disorder, they actually had quite a lot of social intelligence. So their ability to read a room, to predict what other people felt, thought, etc., was quite good. But the moment it got mixed with fear, suddenly it becomes paranoia and they start guessing all these things going on in the room that just aren't there. We've actually taken this a step further than they did. So we then actually took the model we developed, it was a bit more complex than this, and then took it to 2 focus groups of students with social anxiety disorder, partly because I was a bit worried that the language of this sounded a bit judgy, a bit judgmental, and took it to them. And we got some amazing quotes from people saying things like, "This is the most helpful way of understanding my social anxiety I've seen." People would say things like, "I did CBT for 11 weeks and just seeing this has helped me more than those 11 weeks did." And that's a bit of an exaggeration, to be honest. But we're now beginning to wonder if we could develop an intervention based on that idea, building character. Then in Israel, they did a similar thing on obsessive compulsive disorder. Haven't really got time to talk through that, except to say that we've now added to that study as well. So I've got one research student at the moment, and her piece of research is actually looking at perfectionism. So perfectionism is highly, highly associated with all kind of mental health problems, and she's looking at functional and dysfunctional perfectionism. So functional perfectionism is, I just like to do things well, but if I can't do them well, I can live with it. Whereas dysfunctional perfectionism that often leads to mental health problems is, I have to do things perfectly, I have to look perfectly, I have to eat perfectly, I have to exercise perfectly, and that leads to all kinds of problems. And that data comes in 2 weeks, so I don't quite know where that's led yet, but it's sort of an extension of some of these things. And what I find useful about it is it takes me right back to what I opened with, really, which is it means that when we see people behaving in really unusual, strange ways, we begin to change the question that we ask about them. We begin to ask the question, if this was a gift, if this was a strength that's being overused or underused or has turned into something that's corrupted or wrong or distorted in some way, what would the gift be? What's the sort of misused strength that's occurring in this situation? Let me see what comes next. Oh, I don't want that. Now, I was going to go on and finish with two kind of techniques you can use as church leaders, or 2 ways of thinking, but we haven't really got time for them. So let me just tell you what they are very, very quickly. One of them is actually an idea called Diamond's feedback, which as a leader, very often you're involved in giving feedback to other people and telling them what you think. And basically, mental health in any situation, the functionality of any organisation seems to rise around people being able to have a really, really detailed view of what's good in other people. So that was one of the things I was going to talk about. And then the second thing I was going to talk about is a prayerful exercise that you can take away and have a think about, called strengths priming. And this is really the idea that before any difficult meeting, or even for a good meeting, or before there's someone you're going to see, is spend 5 minutes. You could use language like this, or you could go to Scripture and look at fruit of the Spirit, or however you want to do it. Look at the Beatitudes maybe, and just spend a bit of time really thinking and enjoying what's good about the person you're about to meet. And when you look at the research on it, you find that even just doing that for 5 minutes, even in a secular context with no prayer involved, that the engagement goes up, that the outcomes of meetings get better, that people's sense of being heard and listened to, and that your skill in those kind of environments increases as a result of putting yourself in that slightly different domain. So we're finishing at 5. Should we just have, I think we've got 2-3 more minutes for questions. Anything you'd like to ask or say before we finish off?
What are the characteristics of a good scientist?
So the interesting thing is that science can come from many different places. I actually do a whole lecture in which I use Richard Feynman as a kind of example. And one of the interesting things is when you look at really, really outstanding creative scientists like him, weirdly, he's very, very high in curiosity and very high in creativity, which actually that's more likely to be an artist's kind of personality temperament. So he actually weirdly looks like an artist. Whereas you tend to find that most good scientists are high in persistence, high in judgment, which is kind of critical thinking and getting things thinking right, high in love of learning. And I find a lot of Christians, I find, also have quite a high pot of wonder knocking about as well, in terms of isn't it wonderful what I'm looking at. But I'm just, there's some of the things that come up. There's quite a bit of work on it.
From my friend from doing humanities, one of the questions I've got is humility. Science congratulates itself quite a lot. And it's what we don't know.
Yeah.
I wish would be emphasised more.
Yeah.
Because scientists are considered as gods, aren't they? As the answer.
Yeah.
We are. And we haven't got the answers.
Yeah, I mean, the best scientists I know that I've worked, so I have several professors who are very high up in psychology, and they have enormous humility. And I look at them and I think, that's who I want to be like. I think I better finish there, hadn't I?
Okay, we will. Thank you very much, Roger. That was really stimulating, and it's kept us going to the end. If you've got other questions, of course, talk to him as we finish, but it's good to finish at 5, so those of you who need to get away quickly can do so. But let's just thank Roger again for a really stimulating session.
Thank you.